Welcome to the Lovecraft eZine podcast.
And then the bartender says, what is it, some kind of joke?
You've used that one before. You need to get some new material. Today is May the 12th, 2019, and our guest today is Amy Sturgis. Hey, Amy. How's it going?
Hi. Doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Good.
Why don't we introduce ourselves, guys, and then we'll talk to Amy. I'm Mike Davis, Lovecraft eZine. Why don't we start with Rick?
I'm Rick Lay, writer.
I really like
nominee for the Hykranian Award for the Robert E. Howard Foundation.
Oh, no kidding. Wow, congratulations.
Also nominee for the Muncie Award from the Pulp Fest Convention.
Wow. I also like how you introduced yourself a few weeks ago, an obscure writer of obscure books.
Yes.
So.
Against less obscure nominations.
Yeah, congratulations. Pete.
Pete Rawlik, a well-known writer who's overpaid for writing crappy books.
Oh, is that true?
It is.
Ben.
Ben Handelman, reader. Kelly Young stand-in again, unfortunately. And also now I want to ask Rick a bunch of questions later on, so it'll be a full day.
We can do that. All right, you guys, please feel free to jump in and interrupt me when we're talking to Amy, whatever you want to ask her, anytime you want. Just remember, if you're not talking, hit your mute button so that we get the best sound possible. So, Amy, you know what? I'm sure you can introduce yourself better than I can, but I'll just read from your website. Amy Sturgis holds a PhD in intellectual history and specializes in the fields of science fiction, fantasy, and indigenous American studies. So, hey, you want to elaborate on all that?
Hey.
You do a lot of other stuff too.
I wear several hats at the moment. I do. I teach at Lenore Rhine University, and I am the editor-in-chief at Hocus Pocus Comics, and I think the Hocus Pocus family is here. So hi to Dwight and Rebecca. You've had Dwight on your show.
Yes, I have.
And I also am one of the staff at the Hugo Award-winning podcast Starship Sofa. I do an ongoing series called Looking Back on Genre History. So,
oh, wow.
And I'd also like to say hi to my mother and my father who are also here. And happy Mother's Day. So,
you know what? Why don't we start with Pete? Because I know Pete has some questions, and I really love putting him on the spot. It's really fun.
That is totally unfair.
That's unacceptable, I know.
Yeah. Okay. So great. All right. So, I was thinking, and I think we've talked about something similar before, but we talk about film as modern, and not just film, but lots of things as modern mythology. And I'm going back to when I studied classical mythology, and there's always this is the standard myth, but here's the diversion from the myth that's told from this country or from this group. And now I'm looking at how we're going through reboots and remakes and prequels and sequels that literally change what was meant by the first film or even the second or third film. And I'm thinking, are we doing the same thing? And so the only person who might be able to talk to me about this is Amy Sturgis.
No pressure at all. No, I think that's a really interesting idea. What came to mind as you were describing that is, of course, Star Wars, because we first encounter the original trilogy, and this is the adventures of Luke Skywalker. And even at the time when George Lucas is being interviewed, he's calling it the adventures of Luke Skywalker. And then you get the prequel trilogy, and now it looks like it's the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker. Reframes the way we see both sets of 3 films, and now of course with the sequel trilogy and even the standalones. In fact, maybe especially the standalones. If you look at the relationship, say from Rogue One to the original Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, it's reframing it, reimagining it, and coming in from the side as opposed to, or at least shaking things up so that we see things in a different direction. In terms of mythology, I would think part of that is different voices are now part of the storytelling. But even the people who, and also actually, now that I'm composing this as I speak, which is always very dangerous, but one of the things that happened with oral culture, storytelling culture across different cultures, people hear the story and then they want to add to it and they want to change it. And so with the things we're talking about now, like Star Wars, you have fans who grew up fans who are now the storytellers in the universe, right? And so people like, J.J. Abrams and such were fans of the original, and now it's their turn to tell it, in the same way that people would take, say, Arthurian mythology and say, I used to love hearing these stories, but you know what? We didn't have a character from here. Let's put a character from here in and retell a story or make a story around this person. So in that sense, it's participatory and it's intergenerational, and it's also having voices coming from different places. And I really like the idea that we're doing the same thing. I think that fits very well.
Yeah, but I think you brought up J.J. Abrams, who did a fabulous reboot of Star Trek.
Right.
He may not have liked it, but he did something that, he basically said, okay, I want to tell stories about, I don't want to tell new stories. I want to tell stories about these characters and how I would have told them in the first place.
Right.
So he reboots the whole thing and gets to play with those characters in a new way.
And yet we still get the old. It's not replacing it. Like it's just diverging and being. You're right. You're exactly right.
It's almost like the ending of Clue. It could have happened this way,
right?
Not this. And how many because we have this reboot possibility. How many times can we get to do that? And the Halloween movies now.
Right.
Is it? Yeah, it's the Halloween. It's like there's 4 different universes or some nonsense like that. It all depends on whether you want Jamie Lee Curtis to live or die. Did she live in the movie? Did she? It's just like, wait, what? And
choose your own adventure.
Exactly. And it seems interesting to be doing that when it was done orally for such a very long time. Now we're just doing it on film and having an interesting time. It's not always good. It's interesting.
And people are extremely invested in it. The dialogue, the debate that comes up every time, you can see that people feel ownership in and investment in these stories in a way that you wouldn't necessarily something you've just consumed. I mean, these people are participants.
Yes. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. One of my most recent favorite movies to do something like this was Happy Death Day. Where they just replayed the same day over and over again. It's like, but always ending with the character's death.
Right.
Until she figures out a way to get through it. And apparently there's now a sequel. Which, okay. It's like, how that worked, but you know what? I'm in. But yeah, it's sort of, it's kind of interesting to me, and I'm sure that there's a PhD thesis in there somewhere to talk about this.
Right.
But you did bring up the fact that people are heavily invested, but in a lot of Lovecraftian literature, which is where we're at today, people have had to debate what's core to the mythos and what's what's Derelith and what's Lumley and what did Lynn Carter add and what do you want to accept and what do you want to not? I mean, the Joe Pulver, who's a big King Yellow fan, doesn't want anything to do with Hastur.
Right.
And then other people are like, what do you mean there's a difference? For their entire life, the King Yellow has been Hastur.
Mhm.
Can I jump in with an observation real quick, Pete? And then go ahead again. Thank you. I remember some years back reading a letter from a fan about the series Legends of the Dark Knight. And the essence of the letter to DC was, can really all of this stuff really be canon? I mean, I don't see how this could be canon with the current DC universe, something to that effect. And the answer, which is I'm sure more eloquent than I'm going to repeat here, paraphrase here, was these are all just stories. These are legends, and we tell legends, we tell stories. And I think it was a fancy way of saying, an eloquent way of saying, don't worry about it so much.
Well, taking it back to Star Wars, that reminds me of how the older canon, what they now call legends, used to be treated, where when it was created, no one was telling Alan Dean Foster, like, oh, you have to make sure it matches up with this newspaper strip that's also coming out. And then the comic books that were coming out from Marvel at the time. That was all done later in the 90s. Someone tried to figure out, like, well, can we make all of this count? And there's the second largest wiki in the world is the Star Wars one, where they tried to fit all this together. But there's a reason when they got the movies, Disney got the movies, they had to throw all that out because there was so much there. There was no room to tell a story in that, where you could include the original cast at least.
Which reminds me of one of my absolute favorite new works that's not Legends, it's new canon now, from the Star Wars novels, and that's Ken Liu's The Legends of Luke Skywalker. And it is told as the framing device is everyone's on a ship and we're going from here to there, and during this period, we're going to tell each other stories about Luke Skywalker. And there's a very loose connection between the stories, but some of them are clearly false. Some of them are clearly true. Some of them you can't really tell.
That's so brilliant.
It's fantastic, and he's talked a lot about how he sees Star Wars as this long-term participatory storytelling, but in the end, the takeaway is all of these characters, in a sense, themselves are Luke Skywalker. We're all Luke Skywalker. And there's no pressure on the reader to determine at the end which ones were real and which ones were false and which were the product of this sort of galaxy-wide game of telephone, right? And they started out true, and by the time you get to this version of the story, it's false. It's the idea is this is what myth is, right? And so it seems to be very self-aware. But again, Ken Liu grew up a fan of Star Wars, so now he's this fabulous award-winning author and translator, and he gets to add to the universe himself, and he's telling stories about telling stories about stories.
For the audience, is that a book or is it a series of books? Or
It's a single book. It's a single book,
and it's called The Legends of Luke Skywalker.
Yes,
that's brilliant. Thank you.
Oh yes,
I was going to say that if anyone has never gone back and read the original novelization, that's Alan Dean Foster wrote it. It's ghostwritten as George Lucas. He wrote the first novel, and then there's the early comic strips. I'd recommend. They're Star Wars, but no one really knew what Star Wars was at the time. So it's actually kind of fun to read because you can almost feel this, I don't know what you call it, mythos of develop over time when you read this stuff. It's, I want to say in the original novelization, Obi-Wan Kenobi mentions a duck, and Luke's asking what a duck is. Just weird things that you'd never hear in Star Wars now. And so it's kind of fun to read it and sort of see how these writers who had one film and nothing else, or in Foster's case, less than a film to try to go off of.
Right.
And conversely, you have in the new canon a novel called Dark Disciples that was basically written by George Lucas's daughter in combination with a novelist. And it's very interesting to read it's his kid sort of developing a story. She wrote, I believe, for the Clone Wars for a while too. And so you also get sort of like, she's someone that's grew up with this. I would assume most of his kids hate Star Wars at this point, but he grew up with it and sort of became a part of it and got to contribute in her own way to the myths around it. It's very interesting.
I think that there's a nice, it started as a joke in Undiscovered Country, that you have not enjoyed Shakespeare until you heard it in the original Klingon. But now we have all the Shakespeare retold with Star Wars characters, which is, sort of very meta. It was just a drop and a half joke in this series, but we're going to steal it from you. We're going to run with it, right? It's like, who does that? Like, really, really smart people,
Right?
Figuring out that let's retell Macbeth or Hamlet as the Star Trek or Star Wars characters. Sure, why not? Story's already there. We just change the names, protect the innocent or the guilt, whatever. Anyway.
Good stuff.
Yeah. Amy, tell us, especially for the audience, a little bit about you or a lot about you, whatever you want to say. I mean, you're an expert on Lovecraft, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, so many cool things that we like to talk about. And I know you teach those things as well. Can you talk about that and talk about other things you teach and Mythgard, talk about all that?
You bet. I'm incredibly fortunate to have the role that I have. My field is intellectual history, which is the history of ideas, and so that's I kind of take that as as carte blanche. Where are ideas? Everywhere, but I particularly see ideas. I think science fiction is the literature of ideas. Science fiction is the genre in which ideas are the heroes, in a sense. And so a lot of what I do relates to teaching history through science fiction, and I get blurry with the definition of science fiction. So that does touch on things that are, fantasy, for example, and I'm very interested in the Gothic. I think the Gothic is you can't have science fiction until you have the Gothic, because you can't have Mary Shelley until you had Anne Radcliffe first, and so I get to teach some wonderful, wonderful stuff that is thematic. Sometimes it's very, very focused. So I have taught a course just on Lovecraft. I've taught a course just on Sherlock Holmes, a course just on Harry Potter.
You've taught on Sherlock Holmes.
A ratiocination class. So we also got Poe in there at the very beginning, and then
Poe. Yeah, I'm such a fan of everything you're talking about.
It's all connected, isn't it? It really is. I mean, you can just trace threads.
Well, Sherlock is where we got all this idea of pastiche and new writers coming in and a canon. All of that comes from Sherlock fans.
Exactly. In fact, no one used canon in that sense until Sherlock Holmes fans were debating what is and isn't canon. And
really?
You're exactly right.
Okay, I didn't know that.
It's all connected.
I love listening to the show. I learn things.
So, and I get to teach, and I'm also very interested in Indigenous American, Native American history and current studies. And there's an area where that intersects, which I'd love to talk with you about in terms of Indigenous futurism right now, science fiction, and Native American authors. There are some amazing Native authors. I've had good fortune to get to work with some of them, and some of them are also writing fantastic horror as well. I think we're approaching a moment where there's going to be a golden era of Native authors and their literature being respected in genre work, and not just as Native literature.
And
but
you mentioned to me yesterday that Native Americans not only writing all of what you just said, but also writing cosmic horror. I'd love for you to talk about all that real quick, did you have something to say, Pete? No. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Please do talk about that.
Oh, I just want to throw out a couple of recommendations if I could.
Sure.
First of all, I would love to invite people to check out. It's free online. I had the very good fortune in 2017 to be invited to guest edit a double issue of Apex magazine, which is science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and it was all Indigenous authors, and that was August 2017. If you just go to Apex magazine, just Google Apex and Sturgis, and that will show up. And that issue, so I was able to go out and ask some of the authors whose work I admire most to write works for me. And that ended up being almost a book-length issue. And if I may say so, one of the stories in there, which is a great horror piece, Rebecca Roanhorse's Welcome to Your Authentic Indian Experience, trademark, won both the Hugo Award and the Nebula Award for Best Short Story last year.
Oh, wow.
And it also won for her the Campbell Award for Best New Author. So she is one to watch. Everything Rebecca Roanhorse writes is worth reading. And Darcy Little Badger, I should say Rebecca Roanhorse is Okay Owinge Pueblo. Darcy Little Badger is Lipan Apache, and she's also a PhD in, she works with plankton, like marine biology stuff. Talk about cosmic horror.
Oh, yeah.
Her work is available. She has several stories online. The Whalebone Parrot is a really, really good one, but she has quite a few. If you look up Darcy Little Badger, she has a great link on her page on her website that has links to all of her stories that are available online.
Okay.
And
Just real quick, did you say that Apex issue was free to read online?
it is the entire thing. Absolutely.
So like Google Apex and Amy Sturgis and probably take it to it.
I put a link in the YouTube chat right to the issue. So
Okay.
if anyone wants to take a look,
fantastic.
just look in the chat. You'll see it right about
Thank
2
you.
minutes before this.
I knew I liked you, Ben.
Thank you so much. That issue also has a nonfiction essay by the Cherokee scholar Daniel Heath Justice, and it's a preview of a chapter that later came out actually in 2018, his book, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter. And there's a chapter, and this is sort of a smaller version of that chapter, where he talks about horror, science fiction, fantasy. He calls them wonder works, imaginative works, and why it's so important for people to recognize that Indigenous authors are writing these, and why it's so important for Indigenous readers to read Indigenous literature in these genres. It's really good stuff.
And did you say that was in the same issue?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
All right.
So,
Rick, I think you have a question for Amy.
Yeah, yes, to get back to the Sherlock Holmes.
yes.
Did you ever do any research on how French detective writers were trying to incorporate Sherlock Holmes into their own series when Doyle was alive?
I'm more familiar with how he sort of pulled from French examples to create Sherlock Holmes, but I knew that there were people who were sort of taking Holmes and running with it before he had even completed writing his own canon. But I haven't done anything specifically about French writers doing that. I would be interested.
Just to briefly mention what I'm referring to for those who don't know, there was a writer named Maurice Leblanc, who had a popular character named Arsène Lupin, who was a French thief, and he was fighting Sherlock Holmes in his own stories. And Doyle reacted to that by threatening to sue unless he changed the name of the British detective who was fighting Arsène Lupin. So it was changed to Sherlock Sholmes.
How subtle.
Yeah, really.
In the British publisher of Maurice Leblanc changed it to Holmlock Shears. And there seemed to be a ton of characters. Harry Dixon, who was written by a well-known French horror writer named John Ray. There were all these American detectives in French literature who supposedly are proteges of Sherlock Holmes. Dixon being the most famous.
Good.
I could listen to you talk about Sherlock Holmes all day long, both of you. But can you spell it out for me? You teach, and then you teach at Mythgard, and how does all this work? Where do you teach and where, and what do you teach and what's coming up that you're going to be teaching?
Right now, Mythgard sort of has this structure where you offer a course, but they also tape it, and then they have live discussion leaders and people who work one-on-one with the students with their papers and that sort of thing, preceptors, and so right now I believe they're still offering some of my courses, but I'm not actually teaching them live.
Okay,
so I'm
gotcha.
sort of cryogenically frozen and thawed out when they want to offer a course. I believe, so what the future holds, I don't know.
Not to
Yeah,
interrupt, I posted this link when we started. I reposted again. She's got about 12 courses in there. There's a Star Wars one, a Sherlock Holmes one.
Yeah.
It's all on there. You can click on it. There's an audit option. You can pay to be part of the course, like she said, long after it's gone. You don't have to be enrolled in college right now to do Mythgard courses. You can just do them.
That is right. Thank you so much for sharing all these links. I owe you one. Thank you.
You are a holodeck expert.
That's right. Speaking of Sherlock Holmes, right?
Yeah, right. That episode.
Moriarty in the holodeck.
One of my favorite episodes.
Oh, that is a classic TNG. But so right now, actually this summer I am teaching, my home base is Lenore Ryan University. And this summer I am teaching my, The Force of Star Wars, examining the epic class. I teach that one. Actually, I've been teaching that one since 2015. I've taught it at 2 other universities besides Lenore Ryan, but I haven't stopped teaching it since I started teaching because every semester it seems like then there's a waiting list. It's very humbling situation to be in, but it's also a class that I rework every time I teach it because of course there's new content, and so that the joy of that class is it's based around a research project that the students do all semester long. So we cover every film, we cover major literature, we cover all sorts of things about major scholarship about Star Wars together. But at the same time, I work one-on-one with the students and they go off and do their own research project. And that's a trip for me because, we have people who are going into medicine who are looking at prosthetics and Star Wars. And then you have people who are going into, the arts who are looking at language in Star Wars. And you go, people who are interested in history who are doing the parallels of, so it's always, you have as many different, wildly varying projects as you have students. So I know that's coming up.
But in the recent past, like last several years, you've also taught Lovecraft, Lord of the Rings,
right?
Things like that. How did you get into teaching all that?
It's partly because most of what I've been teaching has been in courses that are not married to a particular disciplinary home in terms of the department, liberal studies, for example, or courses, the humanities courses where the project is to teach research. Have a large research project, and the topics may vary. And so, because I'm trained in an interdisciplinary kind of way, I get to get to these courses that are, it's a little bit of history and it's a little bit of philosophy and it's a little bit of, public policy and that sort of thing. I just had the great good fortune to be a guest professor for a semester at Berea College, doing a special topics course on what was there before Berea, and it was a special studies course on the Cherokee Nation and the Shawnee Nation, and where they were before Berea and where they are now, and Cherokee values and Cherokee heritage and Cherokee society are like, and the same thing for the Shawnee Nation and peoples today. And so I get to do a little bit of everything, and it's fabulous for me because I try to write. Writing and such is sort of my first love, and I try to write on the different topics as I'm teaching about them, and sort of build or pick topics as I'm doing research projects. And so usually my teaching and my research sort of go hand in hand, and it helps the energy level when I'm working on something I'm already interested in, and then I get to share it with the students as it's coming to fruition. So a lot of the articles and such I've written sort of came about timed with classes I was teaching. So, for example, my latest Lovecraft piece definitely
You
was
did
related to my
an
Lovecraft
excellent
course.
essay on the shunned house. Yeah, you want to talk
Thank
about
you.
that a bit? I know you and I both wish that I could post this, but it's not
Oh
really
yes,
available.
redo my my headphones there.
That's all right.
Soon, very soon. I hope when it was actually, I've got the book right here. When the rights revert back to me, I want to share. But it's in this book here, this virtual dark tourism book. But it's sort of my love letter to the Shunned House, which is probably, if not my favorite story, it may be my favorite Lovecraft story. But it has
High
some
praise.
pretty. Pardon?
That's high praise. You're not. Maybe even your favorite story. You said.
It may be and I love. There's quite a few. Color Out of Space. It's hard. I should probably, one of my favorites, but I do love the Shunned House so much.
Yeah.
So so that essay, for example, came out of thoughts that I was having while I was teaching the Lovecraft course. So I don't know how much you want me to run amok. I give you really long answers to questions, so I want to bring
that's
myself.
fine. You're so interesting to talk with. I mean that sincerely.
Thank you so much.
Ben and Pete and Rick, I believe all three of you, correct me if I'm wrong, read the essay
Thank
Amy
you so
sent it to
much.
us and enjoyed it. Do you guys want to touch on the essay at all? Do any of you have any questions?
Yeah, I got one.
Rick.
One thought that occurred to me, which I hadn't thought about before until I read your essay, was that the statement of Randolph Carter is dealing with entities like the creature in the Shunned House. Because we're visiting a graveyard where there are these strange allusions to corpses not decaying,
Right.
and growing and being ripe and fresh. So I was wondering if that kind of makes sense.
Oh, it does. It definitely does. And it sort of, if one of the ideas of the Shunned House is that this has to be dealt with, you have to confront it in some way and sort of work through the evil there. It would make sense then that that statement is sort of getting partway through that project, and then and then things go very wrong, right? But I that's a good point. It's something, an entity, as you said. There's a very science fictional quality about that, as well as this thing that won't die, right?
Ben,
I like that.
anything at all?
I was just actually remembering that there's a Navajo translation of Star Wars, and was trying to find it because it's been driving me crazy the last 5 minutes. But they took Star Wars on DVD and they dubbed it into Navajo to help teach the language on the reservation. So sorry, I was completely distracted.
No, that's fine. Pete, anything on the Shunned House essay before I move on?
Yeah, so I read it. I really enjoyed it. It's got some interesting insights.
Thank you.
One of the things that I wanted to bring to your attention was that a couple years ago, for Necronomicon Providence, the assignment for writing to all the writers who wanted to contribute was to set a story in Providence. And I think in that collection, which I can't seem to find, it's not Walk on the Weird Side. I think it's the Necronomicon gift book. Several of those stories present interesting sequels and reinterpretations of what's gone down.
Oh, I'm making notes. Thank
I
you.
will, as soon as I can find it, I'll send a link to it.
Oh, I would be so grateful. Thank you.
Yeah,
I need to read those.
yeah, right. You want to read stories set in Providence by people who love Lovecraft's version of Providence.
Absolutely.
And so it's kind of fun. Some of the stories are set at Waterfire, and some are so here and there. Some are set at the convention. Others, it's just a really enjoyable collection of.
Oh, you're talking about when a bunch of us did different things, different types of stories. Even
Right.
like they had me do a ongoing live tweet thing.
Yes,
That really didn't happen, but we pretended it did. So,
and it was really enjoyable. And I think it plays with some of the it's not some of the observations you made, but it treads some of the same ground.
Oh,
So
I need to.
yeah, and I on that note, so I just mentioned this the other day. When I was younger and I was just a reader, I used to pick up some weird anthology and so it's like Ghosts of the Old South. And I would read, oh, great. And then like a couple months later, I'd find like fantasy and science fiction would have a story about a ghost in the Old South. And then one would appear in fantasy book. And then like a year later, there would be a novel about ghosts in the Old South. Like, oh, man, the universe works in this weird way where somebody gets a cultural idea and they just sort of everybody sort of runs with it, like something triggers everything.
Right.
And now as a writer, I know somebody put out a call for stories. And they that has to run its course over 5 years to a decade. And
the book you're referring to, the Necronomicon book, would be close to impossible for anyone to find anywhere. Wouldn't you say, Pete?
It might be, but I might have 2 copies.
Okay.
So I'll have to, or I can just go through it and scan. Did I say that?
You said that on air. Yeah.
I'll go through it and I'll see what's there.
Bless you.
But yeah, I think
it was very interesting. Yeah.
I think it was a fun idea to force people to deal with the idea of Providence. And
is this different from the Joe Pulver edited book?
Yes, this is the Necronomicon booklet from I don't know what year, 2015 maybe.
I don't know. Yes.
One of my huge regrets is that I haven't gotten to one of these events in Providence because I've obviously been to Providence and done the Lovecraft thing there, but not at Necronomicon Providence, and I've got to get to one of those.
I saw in another interview that you wrote that Tolkien changed your life, and that's no exaggeration. Can you talk about that? How did that happen? How did he change your life?
Well, I think I've a lot of things changed my life along the way, so I've got to reorder it. And I was just in Star Wars there in my head, so let me go back.
Right, and then I moved somewhere else.
That's right, exactly. Tolkien came at a particular moment in my life, and actually helped change my thinking about speculative fiction, because I was a Star Wars person before kindergarten, and I was very much in a science fictional mode, and in many ways I still am. But Tolkien, one of the things that spoke to me through Tolkien was his sense of history and the way he connected his world and built his world from these sort of fundamental building blocks of story, in a way that J.K. Rowling later would, in a sort of different way, but picking out from the language creation to the way the characters were presented, it felt like something that was, like an Icelandic saga kind of thing. And I was really taken by the way he put those things together. and I also think there was something that spoke to me in his larger project of why fairy stories matter, using his term, because he used fantasy in a different kind of way, not just Lord of the Rings. In fact, I think maybe my favorite work by Tolkien is his essay on fairy stories, where he says, this isn't some easy, lighthearted, simple project to just say, oh, let's go imagine something. This is actually the most rigorous intellectual thing you can imagine. This is the highest form of art to create a world and to infuse it with your with these larger meanings, and to give hope and escape and consolation and imagination to people, and that sort of the opportunity to see something larger and connect to something larger. So not only what he created changed my life, but also I think his defense of it maybe even more so. The balance between appreciating all of this stuff is built on lots of other things, and he loved to pick that stuff apart and figure out where all the building blocks came from in world building. But on the other side, he would say, don't get so caught up in what the ingredients are in the soup that you forget to ask, does the soup taste good? And so in that sense, he was also thinking about, is this good?
Yeah,
Does this
story.
work as story? And there's also something else in his work, and it may be tied to the kind of history that I'm most interested in. And I grew up in Oklahoma. The relationships and what do I want to say, exposure I had, not just to the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, but to several nations there, and studying history and studying works by Native authors and teaching Native history. There's a sense in Tolkien where he talks about all our experiences soaked in a sense of exile. And in that sense, he's talking from his Catholic perspective about we're not in paradise, right? We know we should be somewhere we're not. But I kind of took that in a different way through the lens I was reading it, and I think that permeates all of his work. That sense of knowing a history, but also recognizing there's tremendous injustice. There's divorce between what was and what is. A sense of a journey that's not complete, and a sense of trying to recover history and appreciate. Reclaim is a better word than recover. Reclaim history. And so I think he just spoke to me in a lot of ways, and I fear I ramble when I go off like this, but I think his work's incredibly powerful, and the fact that it can be read through different lenses is one of the reasons people are still so very interested and moved by him today. People who are not, white English guys, Catholics, right? I mean, he speaks to us in wherever we are in different ways, and of course has inspired all kinds of creativity, like so many of the other creators we share in common that we like.
Yeah, it's such an obvious thing to say, but the sheer vastness of what he did is incredible. The poetry, the world building, it's mind-boggling, seriously.
And even when he went further, whether it's Silmarillion or some of his Lost Tales, you always got the sense you were just seeing the tip of the iceberg. That fascinates me. You always got the sense this was vast and old, and you were only seeing a little part of it.
Yeah. You also said in that same interview that movers and shakers of my world were Robert Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, and Frank Herbert. I really perked up when I saw the Ray Bradbury one. So big fan of Ray Bradbury?
Absolutely. The Veldt was the first thing I read by Bradbury, and it was like somebody had taken the top of my head off and shined a light, a spotlight on a place of my brain I didn't even know I had. And actually, I got to say, one of the great things that has happened very recently to me, actually, just mere weeks ago, I got to spend a little bit of quality time at the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies in Indianapolis, and that was. They kind of had to threaten to call the guards on me and drag me out because I just wanted to stay. It was amazing. It was just they recreated his office. They literally just dismantled it and brought it to Indianapolis and put it together. And I think the room is like 6 inches off what his office was, but it's all there, all of his books and all of his things.
Right.
And
he had an office in the basement, if I remember correctly.
right, exactly. And it's just but they've also got vast stores of his correspondence and his awards, and it's a trip. And interestingly, the Martian Chronicles is my favorite work by Bradbury, and the indigenous futurism, this movement for native science fiction and sort of native authors writing about a future in which natives are not only present but flourishing. The scholar who created the term indigenous futurism said that the bridge text that led to sort of opening the door for native authors to do this was Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, and considers Bradbury a great author, as I already did, but I loved that connection because so much of Martian Chronicles is a dealing with the notion of the West, right? It's
Right.
a retelling. It's not about Mars at all,
Did you ever get to hear him speak live?
Only not live. I've seen recordings of him speaking live, but I would have loved to.
I live in Los Angeles, and until he passed away, every year on his birthday, there was a genre bookstore in Glendale, and the owners were friends of his, and he would come and speak and do autographs. Like I've got, this is Fahrenheit 451. That's his. I mean, he was pretty drunk at the time, but that's his signature.
That's a great story.
He's
amazing.
He's the best public speaker I've ever seen. I mean, he was better than anyone. He spends all of his time talking about things like he told stories about going to see King Kong as a kid in the theaters, and that doesn't sound like it's interesting. And then it's amazing. And he would have like a glass of wine. He was like 89. He'd had a stroke, so he's not in the best of health. So that one glass of wine, he would get more and more excited as he's drinking and talking. And then it was so interesting to listen to him because he's been around long enough that people have already reinterpreted his works.
Right.
Fahrenheit 451 is his least. The one he least appreciates how people have reinterpreted it, because they took his message of, well, as a society, we got rid of books. We thought learning wasn't important anymore. And they made it to say the exact opposite political beliefs than the ones he has. He was actually a very, very conservative. He was very proud of like knowing George W. Bush personally and all of these things. And every time I saw him speak, inevitably a teacher would ask him about how Fahrenheit 451 related to the Patriot Act and all of this stuff. And he would go off. But he's so influential, and he had been around for so long. He actually lived to see that happen. And I don't think most writers, even Tolkien, didn't really get to see how that played out. Robert E. Howard, Lovecraft, most of these guys don't ever get to see how their work sort of influences the future, and he really did.
Right. Ugh.
Amy, you mentioned the Martian Chronicles. You probably remember a story called Night Meeting.
Yes.
Might be my favorite Bradbury story.
They can't see what the other one sees.
Right.
Oh, it just that's
it's great. Sorry, Rick, you were going to say.
It's good stuff.
Amy, did you see the recent Mission to Mars episode of the Twilight Zone revival?
I have not seen it yet. It is on my to be watched list. I have not seen it yet. You recommend?
Well, it has a spaceship called the Bradbury.
Well, enough said. Fabulous. That's wonderful. I'm very very far behind in my viewing, but that's on the list. So I need to kick that up to the top.
Rick, is the Twilight Zone getting any better than the first 2 episodes?
Of the last 4, I disliked two, but I like the Mars one and I like the most recent one,
Okay.
which was sort of like borrowed a little bit from movies and stories like The Color Out of Space, where meteorites cause problems.
So Rick's saying skip all the episodes except for the most recent 2. Don't bother. Don't waste your time with the others. Any of them.
Well, I liked
He likes
the
the
first 3 very well. I didn't like the Traveler, and I didn't like the kid becoming president of the United States.
It's terrible. It's terrible.
I thought that first episode, I think most of you disagree with me, if I remember right, was the most god awful mess. Oh man, I think that episode is just a piece of shit. Jesus.
I really like the one I really like. I really
that's my me with my technical talk on this. Yeah,
I say I love the 3rd episode though.
That I have not seen.
Which is the video recorder.
All right, I'll have to try it.
Yeah, you know, I actually a good friend of mine I had dinner with. He's an executive producer and he's worked in television for a long time. And I talked to him about that because the Twilight Zone's always been political and it's always had a message in many of the episodes. But the skill with which you deliver that message, I like the concept behind the rewinding episode, but the message it delivers, it becomes so ham-fisted at the end. It feels very amateur. And
whereas like the recent season of Doctor Who.
Right. And whereas like the original Twilight Zone, it's not that it didn't deal with these issues of race or politics, the McCarthyism of the era, but it dealt with them in more better written ways. I don't even know of a technical way to put it.
Yeah.
And that's really, I feel like every Twilight Zone episode, that's what we're sort of getting. We're getting sort of like, oh, I watched a Twilight Zone before, I know how to do this, and they don't. They have no idea what they're doing.
That latest season of Doctor Who, as I said, I mean, I agree with every message that they're sending. I personally agree with it, but they're hammering you over the head with it. You know what I mean? They're not telling a good story. The first thing they have to remember is tell a great story. You know, whatever message you want to send.
And Amy, that's what you mentioned about Tolkien, where some people like Michael Moorcock may disagree that it was a good story, but he really did put the effort into making it so that it was an enjoyable read. It wasn't just him teaching you Catholicism through fantasy. It was a completely enjoyable adventure that made billions of dollars in the box office.
Pete? I'm sorry, Amy, go ahead.
Oh, I was just
trump Pete, so.
No, never. I was just saying, Tolkien was very conscious of the whole idea of allegory, you know, and he would. That's sort of the difference between Tolkien and C.S. Lewis in some ways. But he was concerned about the whole. This guy is really, you know, Hitler, or this person is really such and such. And he said that's bad storytelling. You can't do it that way.
I heard he got upset. Tell me if I'm right or wrong about this, but I seem to remember reading a story a while back, years ago. I mean, where at some point someone had asked him if Nazi Germany was sorry, I just went blank.
Mordor,
thank you. And he didn't agree. He didn't want to talk about it.
Right, exactly. And part of that is if you assume that, for example, all orcs are Nazis, then once the Nazis are gone, you never have to worry about orcs again, right? And his idea was that evil is always going to come back, and so all Nazis may be orcs, but not all orcs are Nazis. And so he didn't want to make things so immediate talk about notions of good and evil, but don't say we are right now just talking about World War II or what have you, because that, first of all, it leads to very poor storytelling, as apparently were some of these episodes you were talking about show, that it's just transparent. And so you feel like you're just, but also you lose texture, you lose stuff that will make these stories last for and say bigger things than just responding to the moment. So yeah, definitely. I think that's one of his secrets, is that he's got a bigger canvas he's working on.
Which is where C.S. Lewis loses me.
Yes.
Because it is so obvious what's being fed.
Yeah.
Right.
And, it's one of the things we were watching it, and it's like all the ugly monsters are bad and all the beautiful monsters are good. And that's just the way it was. That's the way it was written, and that's not the way the real world is.
And where he really lost me, C.S. Lewis. I do love the stories. I mean, I'm looking at them right now. Got them right up there, but and I've even got them on audio drama, which is really great. But where he loses me especially is with Susan. She didn't really do anything wrong, at all, but she's left behind.
Have you read Neil Gaiman's story about Susan?
Yes,
Yeah.
It's brilliant. Yes, it's been a few years, but I loved it.
He read that before it was published, I think, or at least before I had read it published, at a Mythopoeic Society conference that I went to, and when he finished reading it, I was just tears, and I was like, "Oh, I'm embarrassed." I just bawled over this story, and I looked around, and everybody else was crying too. I was like,
Yeah.
"Okay, yeah, that story is as powerful as I think it is."
Thank you for the reminder, because I want to reread that. Yeah, it's just what did this girl do wrong? Oh, she put on makeup. Come on. Pete Rick, I think he has.
C.S. Lewis's Martian trilogy is much better than Narnia.
And that's a good point.
And then hitting his strength ties into Lord of the Rings in a strange way.
All right, elaborate on that. Don't leave it hanging.
There's a reference to, I think it's Numamor. There's a reference to things from Lord of the Rings.
Oh, okay.
There's I just want to. We don't talk about Narnia hardly at all. I don't know if we ever. But I just want to randomly shout out my favorite passage from Narnia is in the last book, and it's been too long, when the king's trying to appear to them and ask for help, and Peter and the rest of them, everybody except Susan is gathered around the supper table. You guys remember that? And Peter says, "Shadow or vision or whatever you are," something like that. "You have a Narnian look about you, and we are the seven friends of Narnia. I am Peter the High King." And that's such good writing that I got chills. I get chills every time I read that passage. So.
So I will. It's this week. We were having a discussion about a mandate that was written 25 years ago to collect samples in some place, and somebody said, "Well, we can't find that mandate, but we found this contract that we wrote 25 years ago," and they sent it to me, and it's a contract I wrote, and I literally sent it back to them and said, "Do not cite the old Magic to Me witch." I was there when it was written, because it was just so ridiculous to send me something I wrote and established as part of my career and tell me that I was misinterpreting it.
Well, speaking of Pete Rollick.
Uh-oh. What did I do now?
Let me tell you what he did. No, you've taught some Pete Rollick fiction, right? What did you
Oh,
do?
no.
Oh, I'll tell you
Weird Company?
Reanimators and
Yeah,
Weird Company, those two, and I've had students do like papers on them, and the way not only, I mean, capturing the idea of serialized work and capturing basically beautifully, um, not only homage but sort of enhancing. I mean, it's impressive stuff. Not only the writing, but the way different texts come in and out of those.
Oh, yeah.
It's just beautiful.
Yeah, I'm a big Philip Jose Farmer fan. And,
That fits.
yeah.
That fits beautifully.
And Rick and I both worked for Jean-Marc Lovett. Yeah, whatever. It's a French.
Wow.
Whatever it is, it's in French.
Rick wants to pronounce it for you.
Go ahead.
It's L'Officier.
L'Officier.
For
I
God's sake.
used to mispronounce it for years. So
And I took the opportunity. Okay, so for example, in Reanimators, I'm a big Charlie Chan fan, and when Charlie Chan the movies and some of the early books start, he says, "I am 80 winters old," and then he goes on to have a 40-year career.
So if anybody's counting back there,
Yeah. So yes, I'm like, okay, how do you do that? Well, here's how it happened.
love that.
Yeah, it's just a little, and I love doing little name drops and but
The Phantom. Oh,
right?
Ah.
One of the first stories I ever wrote. And some people are like, why did it have to be Phantom of the Opera? I'm like, why couldn't it be the Phantom of the Opera?
Why not? If you can't, that's like be yourself unless you can be a dragon. And if you can be a
Right.
dragon, then be a dragon. You know,
Right. Yeah.
why wouldn't you do that? Oh, I remember like sort of giving a shout at the end of that story. It's like, ah,
But
Oh, wow.
the funny thing is that, like,
Aw shucks moment there, Pete.
yeah, I am. It's like the thing I get called out on that story, the Mask in Exile, I get called out on the most is The Devil Went Down to Georgia. Because
Oh God, I'm so sick of that song.
well, they're going to perform a play, a Faustian play, but it's set in Tbilisi, which is in Georgia, but it's not our Georgia.
You've made me think of that song, and if I repeat that song over and over in my head tonight, you're in trouble, man.
it's the Russian Georgia.
It's the Russian Georgia.
We should say the Asian Georgia.
Yes. So, Mike, what you need to know is that is like one of the few songs that I know by heart,
Oh my
and
God.
I've used it as a lullaby for my kids.
Yeah, I've sung it. It's been 50 years. I'm sick of it, you know. So
I think it's in the 70s. Is it really? Oh God, it's 50 years.
speaking of counting there, yeah.
yeah. So I personally think I think I just have one more question left for Amy. You were named whatever this is. It sounds really cool. You were named one of the 365 notable women of Star Wars from the 365 Days of Star Wars Women Project. What's that?
That was a thrill, let me tell you. So that project was conceived as a way, a researcher, wonderful Star Wars commentator and critic, who wanted to honor women in Star Wars, and this is at the height of debate that sort of came up after recent Star Wars fandom debates, so we're talking about 2016, 2017, about, girls in Star Wars, right? And the fandom has been a bit contentious at times, and so what she wanted to do was point out the women have always been in Star Wars, and she started with her project talking about female characters in Star Wars. And she also wanted to talk about women who were instrumental in making Star Wars, both in front of and behind the screen. So actresses and animators and sculptors and all these different women who contributed to Star Wars all along the way. But as the project developed, she wanted to bring in people who have related to Star Wars and in other ways. And she knew that I had been teaching this class on the Force of Star Wars, examining the epic for semesters in a row at this point. And I had also been doing I'd done some podcast episodes focusing on the history of Star Wars and certain aspects of Star Wars, like for example, Lucas talked about one of the big themes being history repeats itself, and we have this tendency for democracies to elect tyrants. And he talked about when he was in his own notes building Star Wars, things like Caesar and Napoleon and Hitler, and how these things seem to happen over and over again. So I've done stuff on looking at the history behind Star Wars as well as the history of Star Wars. Anyway, she apparently learned about me from some of that stuff, and the project was to do in-depth focuses on characters, but also when it was possible, do in-depth interviews with women who had been involved with Star Wars. And so I was one of the lucky scholars who got to be brought in as one of those women, and I got to do a long interview with her about what Star Wars means to me. And I'm a first-generation fan. I was 5 years old when the original Star Wars came out, and I was there. and so it was hugely thrilling to me to be named among the creators, the storytellers, and even the fictional characters who were and are women who are important to Star Wars. So now I feel like that's something I've got to continue to sort of live up to in a way. And as I'm looking forward to my projects, what comes next, that's in my mind. I've got to earn that, and sort of try to keep earning that. But it was thrilling to me to be named among those women for that every day for a year. Amy Richau, I believe is how you pronounce her last name, Richau, led that project, and she's continuing that now. It's not every day now, but she's as new women storytellers are brought into Star Wars, she's doing interviews with them as well.
Oh, okay. Anyone else have any questions before we let Amy go?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious of your thoughts on so Star Wars is a perfect example of, it's always had a very broad fan base, all political types, across different people groups, across even national boundaries. And you can look at the fandom in Japan and everything, for example. And but it's also a perfect example of the recent sort of online fan communities and how they have sort of, I hate to generalize and say toxic, but it becomes like a very sharp, politically tinged divide. So in the Star Wars case, some people have latched on to the gender of the main character of the new trilogy. Some people, it's they're just so angry that something like, so they expected Luke Skywalker to be treated like he had in the past, and he's treated differently, and they just become so sort of violently moved in this direction. I'm curious, like, have you seen, so in all your studies of this past works, is that historically been a case before? Is that sort of a new, sort of unique to online media?
It is different, and I'm not sure I totally agree with the whole premise, but I totally understand. I mean, I understand what you're saying about the contention in the online debates, and it's also fraught with. I mean, there's been a really interesting scholarly study saying how many Russian bots were related to the latest contention, but it's interesting to note that it's only more immediate because we can speak to each other in more immediate ways, and also in more anonymous ways now. There's been, for example, in Star Wars, a strange divide that wasn't in, say, Star Trek. because early on there was a lot of fan activity, and it just happened to be, and I'm not even quite sure why, although I have theories, but kind of gendered in the sense that guys at the time were making Star Wars fan films as fan tribute, and a lot of women were expressing fan creativity through fan fiction. And it so happened that Lucas, who always privileged the visual over the textual to begin with, but also had been kind of a fan filmmaker himself, as in his own sort of personal development, um, brought fan film creators into the fold, and ultimately then established awards for the best fan films. At the same time, Lucasfilm was sending cease and desist orders to people who were writing fan fiction. And so sort of one of the things that came out of that was the idea that some fans were superstars and some fans were criminals. I mean, that's kind of the way that some were going to be celebrated, and some were going to need to go underground if they were going to have the kind of fan creativity they desired. And so there's been a weird dynamic, and that's just one example. There's several of weird dynamics of how fan interactions happened, but of course that played out over months and years, as opposed to 3 solid days on Twitter, where everything happens so quickly now. But I think in the end, part of this is going to be generational. And I see from my students real confusion sometimes about why people are making a deal out of the things that they're making a deal out of. And I also see that, different people today have different points of entry. It may be Star Wars Rebels or Resistance, as opposed, it may be animated, it may be gaming that's entry points for Star Wars, as opposed to the very first time you encountered Star Wars, it was with A New Hope. And so even the entry points into where you began the narrative changes people's dynamics. But I think it's part of it may also be something that's going to work itself out generationally. I tend to be a lot more optimistic than other people, because I think some of the toxicity, which I do agree is there, is part and parcel of social media, and next week it will be something else that's toxic. I don't think it's something that's going to destroy Star Wars. I think Star Wars is actually much bigger than and a much more unifying factor. I think the most recent Star Wars celebration sort of reflects that. And in fact, that was a kind of healing of rifts too. If you see sort of the reaction, for example, to Ahmed Best getting love, and there was a whole period of time where if Jar Jar Binks had first come on when everybody was on Twitter, that would have been a bloodbath online, right?
Oh, sure. And the hate for the prequel trilogy, it's not like it didn't exist. I remember I was an adult when the prequel trilogy is coming out, and I remember very vividly how badly people, I mean, to this day, there is a group of people in their late 30s to their 50s that refuse to watch the prequels, won't talk about them. That's not real Star Wars. Right. But then you have a whole generation of people that are, say, younger than 30, who grew up with the prequel trilogy as Star Wars films, just like the other 3. But I've noticed, as I said, it just seems more what I saw happen with both Rogue One and then Last Jedi. And it's almost like they're opposite sides. It seemed surprising to me, because I'd not seen that even with the hate the prequel trilogy got. It was mostly just not really fans, just people sort of, I don't like this anymore. And they don't recognize their own sort of nostalgia, or, hey, I watched this when I was 7, or 7-year-old's reaction and a 25-year-old man's reaction are not going to be the same thing. And so some of it's that, but there's also, I don't know, I've noticed it's not just the gendered politics stuff, which is, of course, on social media today, that's always going to be a target of things, but it's more of just how loud or how much, or how as I said, it almost seems violent in like an online, not actual violent sense, but people just react so aggressively to some of these things. I don't remember the prequel trilogy hate. We had the internet then. I don't remember it getting that much hate at the time.
I don't, when I see, a classroom full of people, I don't see that. I do see it on Twitter, but then I think of things like Gamergate. I mean, that really was violent. So I don't know. I don't know how that will all play out, but I don't think, I'm not worried about it, because I don't, my perspective is different in part because I get to spend time with these, these mostly 20 somethings, but they're younger and they're older in my classes as well, and kind of see how they relate to it, and how they also sort of, sometimes completely, let that sort of thing pass them by, which I think is fantastic. I don't know how they can tune that stuff out, but they do. And for again, there's also things like the 365. I mean, there's a whole lot of positivity. The Star Wars in the Classroom is another incredibly positive online phenomenon, taking Star Wars and finding all kinds of ways to use it as a teaching platform. So I think, I'm not sure it's as big a difference as it might appear, or that it's going to be a lasting phenomenon. I definitely don't think it'll be a lasting phenomenon.
All right. Well, Amy, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, this has been
Really
fabulous.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And I thank you for letting me run amok a bit too.
Oh, no problem. And thanks,
I
guys, for the great
thoroughly
questions.
enjoyed it. Absolutely. Thanks to everybody. And I hope you have a great evening. Thank
You too.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Just have to close your browser and it'll kick you out there.
So long.
All right. Thank you.
Mike, I gotta go.
Okay. All right. Have a good one, Rick. Thank you.
Thank
She's
you.
always so pleasant and
Yes.
knowledgeable and willing to talk about really anything we want to talk about.
Yeah. Well, it's been several years. We'll have to get her on more often.
Yeah.
Have you guys listened to the Case of Charles Dexter Ward podcast, the recent podcast?
No, I haven't.
No, I downloaded it because BBC will remove stuff after a time, but they also make so every show they have, there's an MP3 download option, even if they'll remove it a month later. It's like 7-8 episodes long. I've been kind of waiting on it.
Well, it's fantastic, and it didn't really come from the BBC. They just aired it. I emailed the BBC and said I'd love to interview whoever did this, and they said, "Well, we didn't do it really. These people did it." So those people, on June the 2nd, our guests will be the folks from the Case of Charles Dexter Ward podcast. So anybody out there listening to this, if you haven't listened to that, you should. It's fantastic.
That's cool.
Yeah, really cool.
I know how much you like radio dramas.
Yeah, well, they approach it from the standpoint of this is going on right now. It's like a real podcast. They talk to each other and they go do interviews. It's set in the near present, like 2017, I think, 2018.
Okay.
It's just really good. What Strange Company and Others, Pete? Is that out or is that coming out soon?
June, beginning of June, I think.
Okay, great.
So, but it's available per pre-order.
Okay, Strange Company and Others, and that's the 4th book.
That is let's see, that would be the 5th book.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't remember how I found this. If somebody recommended it to me or if I just stumbled across it. Found a little book called Whispered Echoes. It's available in print and Kindle. Whispered Echoes by Paul F. Olson, Olson. Introduced by Chet Williamson. We know him. And I'm like on the 3rd story, and the first story is still with me. It's really, really it just it's such a simple concept,
Oh yeah.
and yet so horrifying. So I'd encourage anyone to pick up that book. And I have not read every story in there yet because I jump around sometimes. And Exaltation by Ted, is it Chang? Just came out, so I read the first story in that too, which was fantastic. Um, so,
Yeah.
which,
Paul is Paul was an editor for he edited Postmortem
okay.
and Dead End City Limits. So yeah, that's where in I think in the 90s. So yeah,
Yeah, I had never heard the name before. So,
yeah, I know it, but he's not prolific. So
well, you don't have to be.
no,
Just as long as whatever you do put out there is quality.
yep.
And I would not have been able to buy that Exaltation book if it had not been for a very nice birthday gift from David Del Cole. And David, I really appreciate it. He sent me one of the best gifts you can ever receive, gift certificate to Amazon. So I bought it with that. And yeah, Exaltation just looks great. Did you guys see the Watchmen trailer?
I did.
Did.
So I haven't been keeping up with this project other than knowing it's going on HBO.
Yeah, me too.
And watching that trailer, other than the mask that looked kind of like Rorschach's mask and someone who I think is supposed to be Ozymandias, I feel like I missed a memo or something. I don't get
I don't get it
going
either.
on.
I was underwhelmed. Pete?
Well, I can divorce myself from the source material. So if
Sure, of course, as long as it's a good story.
right, so I'm interested. I'm interested in identity, and I have a long history. One of my favorite comics of all time is Matt Wagner's Grendel.
Yes.
And Matt Wagner's Grendel goes from being a villain to an anti-hero to a hero to a cultural identity. And it would be interesting to see something similar played out with Rorschach. I don't know if that's what they're doing, but that sort of that idea leaves me open to that interpretation.
I don't hold the Watchmen on the pedestal that a lot of comic book fans do. I think most of the themes Alan Moore was trying to deal with were actually dealt with better the year prior with Squadron Supreme by Mark Grunwald. And it's an unfortunately forgotten book, but he dealt with a lot of these ideas of what happens if you really have superpowered people that can take over the government, that can change the world. What if your heroes aren't the perfect heroes you think they're supposed to be? All these themes.
There's a series coming out like that. I forget the name of it.
The Seven.
Is
that
it
it?
7? Yeah.
But with Watchmen, part of what soured me on it is Moore's reaction to anyone even talking about it, let alone like the film. It's not that it's like this amazing film that I've watched 100 times, but I think Zack Snyder came up with a better ending than Alan Moore did. It fit the story better to me. I thought it was a more, if you're trying to stop the world from ending in a nuclear war, like his ending made more sense to me than Alan Moore's did, things like that. And then
Probably get hate mail, but I have to agree.
Yeah, I'll take the hate mail. It's fine. You can just forward it to me. It's good. But so a lot of the reaction I've seen through the trailer, for example, is just, oh, how dare they try to make a sequel? And it's like, well, DC Comics has the much delayed Doomsday Clock right now, which is a sequel to Watchmen that's merging it with the DC universe as like a big event.
Yeah, it's like take your time, guys. Just put it out when you're good and ready.
Oh, which they're doing. I think it's been running 2 years. They've had 9 issues, but it's really good. The sequel parts to Watchmen.
I can't afford the damn thing. I'm waiting for the graphic. No, I'm waiting for the omnibus. I mean, what is it? $5 an issue or something?
Yeah, but the first couple of issues are on DC Universe.
Oh well.
So you can go check.
I'll try I'll try that there then.
But it's the Watchmen parts of it, I think, are actually like a really well done sequel to Watchmen. So I think there's work to be done. It's not like Moore created this from nothing, right? He took Steve Ditko's The Question, and then he took Steve Ditko's objectivist and Ayn Rand politics and merged the two and created Rorschach. And Rorschach's not, I mean, there's things Rorschach said that were said in a Punisher comic book like 2 or 3 years earlier. It's not as original or like this, Alan Moore had divine inspiration, just came up with a story. He was writing his own sequel to other characters, and DC, who owned those characters, were like, hey, let's call this something else so it's not, so it can be its own
Right.
work. So this idea that they can't make a sequel, it's like, well, you need to grow up a bit.
All right, what about It Chapter 2, the trailer? Did you guys see that?
No, I haven't watched that trailer yet. I'll
Okay.
watch the movie, but I'd have to go back and watch the first half of it again because I think it's been too many years.
It's been 2.
Yeah.
It hasn't been decades or anything.
No, but
Too many years, he said.
there's no. I don't understand why there was a delay. It's not even the
That's
same
true.
character. So
Well, I'll just say that I'm cautiously optimistic. It looked like it's going to be pretty scary. It's supposed to be bloodier than the first one, which makes sense because the first one was, kids.
yeah,
Yeah, and I mean, well, that's sort of, as much as they choose to follow the novel, that would sort of make sense as well there.
Yeah. I don't think either of you watched Supernatural, do you?
no.
I'm behind on this season because they removed it from Amazon, so I haven't had an easy way to catch up.
It's on Netflix now, I think.
I'm 18 years behind.
Well, let me tell you this. You're 14 years behind. For the audience that does like Supernatural, I'll just briefly say this, that Supernatural finale was the best finale in 14 years. That was amazing.
That's better than season 5?
You know what? I withdraw that but yes, other than season 5, it's
Okay.
the best.
I need to watch it then.
Yeah.
I fell a few episodes behind, and then they hit the mid-season break, and that's when Amazon lost the rights to have it.
Right,
And
but it was
suddenly,
on Voodoo.
I could only find like the previous 5 episodes, and I was 8 behind, and it was like, oh, I'm gonna have to wait then.
No, it's on Voodoo. It was actually half the price.
Oh, it was? Okay, I didn't know it was there.
Yeah, but I do think that they have this practice every year. Is almost as soon as the finale is aired, days later, the entire season is on Netflix. So, obviously that's working for anyone. It's working. Brightburn. I can't wait to watch Brightburn.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah, there was a new clip where he demolishes a car with a guy in it. So Brightburn is basically if Superman were evil type of movie. So,
that first trailer, I didn't know they were even making this movie, and then I saw the trailer. I think it was actually our very own Kelly Young that shared it, and the trailer looked awesome. The idea of like a horror movie of with a Superman villain, so to speak. I thought that's like at least based on how they're doing these trailers, it looks amazing. So I can't wait.
Yeah. You guys want to talk about anything? I've got a little list here, but
No, keep going.
I want to thank David Pluff for this. I just unexpectedly got the 50th anniversary edition of Fahrenheit 451 in the mail as a gift from listener David Pluff. And yes, it does have Ray Bradbury's signature in there. So pretty cool. Great gift. Thank you, David. It was totally unexpected. So
Your signature is a little bit more legible than mine, so I prefer mine. No offense.
okay, that's fine. We can both keep ours. I think that might be all I had. I was going to ask you guys who's a bigger badass, Thanos or Darkseid, but
It's what's funny to me is when they do finally put Darkseid in a movie someday, everyone's going to complain that he's a Thanos ripoff, and he predates Thanos. Thanos was almost a completely different character that they sort of morphed into Darkseid. I mean, I guess not objectively. Grant Morrison turned Thanos into some sort of multi-dimensional being that exists in all reality or some weird thing. So technically he can never die and he has infinite power. He just can't access it in this universe or some nonsense. But if you want to argue like comic book rules, it's Darkseid. But
well,
Thanos,
I don't want to bore anyone who's not a comic book fan, but I have a quick question. Does in the DC multiverse, is there a different Darkseid for every? I don't think this has ever been addressed. Is there a different Darkseid for every universe?
I may be misquoting because it's been a long time since I read Final Crisis, but Grant Morrison made it that there is a true Darkseid that exists in all realities. So the entire, not just the multiverse, it was like the multi-bubble, gigantic hyper-time something. So that's
Timey-wimey.
Yeah, it's so Grant Morrison really likes drugs, and that comes across
Don't we all?
stories. And I don't remember the explanation exactly, but the idea is that they're different incarnations, but they're all the same being. I don't know how that makes any sense.
It sounds like they're different. It sounds like basically saying the same thing, a different way of saying the same thing, that there's a different Darkseid in every universe.
But they're all the same Darkseid, really. That's like they're literally the same being. That's just his physical manifestation in that universe. If I'm remembering Grant Morrison's crazy, because there was something about how they had to they killed Darkseid, but he resurrected himself inside some assistant to Miracle Man, or there's I don't know, probably 700 Grant Morrison issues on DC Universe app that I recommend you go track down if you want to know the story. Because it carries through in like all of his Batman books. He did a 7 Soldiers of Victory collection of miniseries. It's like 30 issues. He did Final Crisis, which is 7 issues for the main series, and there's literally something like 100 tie-ins to it. It's I don't know, but his ideas. He used some of these in. He's used these ideas in his other work before. The idea that there's these hidden information beings that exist outside reality, and they impress themselves upon us, and that's where we get myth and superheroes and things. This is something that he says he believes. Like it's his. He said he got really high one night.
Yes, that's what I was about to say.
Yeah. I'm not I mean, this is what he says.
On the other hand, drugs.
And he fully admits he used a lot of them when this happened. But this is his. So to him, Darkseid is one of these like multi-universal beings that something. I don't know. I like to think of Darkseid as how Jack Kirby created him, which was he's an evil dark god and he's looking for the anti-life equation so he can conquer the universe. It's a much more fun, simple story. Jack Kirby is a brilliant artist, so it was fun to read. But that's modern Darkseid is unkillable, apparently.
Pete, you got nothing? Nothing? Want to talk about?
Ben's going off the way. He's perfectly fine.
Well, yeah.
I wish Rick were still here because he'd probably be able to cite scholarly articles on this stuff because he always knows 50 times more about this than I do. But yeah, I mean that's just how I remember it. It's one of those areas where I feel like people have gotten a little too deep into the comic books, and
I was going to say, on the other hand, do we care? I don't know if this is a good time or not, but I'll do it. I have a stack of DC novels that. Oh no, they're not all DC. Superhero novels, let's say. First and foremost, Superman, Last Son of Krypton, which came out in '78 when the movie came out. No, it is not a novelization. It is.
Yeah, it's not a novelization because Mario Puzo wrote the film, and
Right.
in his contract, they were not allowed to make an adaptation of the film.
Which I'm glad that happened, because this is such a great Silver Age Superman novel. Isn't it, Ben?
It is, and as was the sequel, Miracle Monday.
Miracle Monday, yes.
I have it in a bookshelf.
Batman Fear Itself is very good. So
it's sort of written as a sequel to Batman Begins, but not really. But it's kind of that's sort of the starting point for it. I would argue.
I would disagree.
You would? No,
it's the third novel in from Del Rey. First one was Dead White. Second one was Inferno.
Inferno, yeah. And
this is the third, which I'm upset that Inferno got made into an audio drama and Fear Itself didn't, because Fear Itself is much better than Inferno.
I couldn't stand Inferno, and I don't remember Dead White at all, which is probably not a good sign. I have it in a bookshelf over there somewhere. I remember specifically they were trying to go with sort of a so Batman Begins had just come out in theaters, so they were trying to like sort of stick close, or it's not a sequel, but it's sort of like to stick in that idea of how Batman Begins did Batman.
Yeah.
I liked it a lot. It's I recommend not reading the Batman Begins novelization. It's not actually that good.
Yeah.
But, this is probably the best Batman novel, I would argue.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. Stone King's not bad at all. It's pretty good.
That was the JLA.
Yeah, it's Batman. It's Batman and the Justice League with a focus on Batman.
Yeah.
Here's Inheritance by Devin Grayson, and it's Aquaman, Green Arrow, and Batman and their three sidekicks. And it really goes into the history, a lot of history of the sidekicks. It's a pretty interesting book.
And that's an analog to, they also at the same time came with a novel called Last Sons, which was Superman, Lobo, and Martian Manhunter, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
This, which I haven't read Inheritance. I read Last Sons. I enjoyed it, but it's not. I wouldn't call it revolutionary. It's just sort of like a fun Superman.
Well, I don't have the novel. I have the audio drama, and I still haven't listened to it. I don't know if I like the concept of it, but I'll try it sometime. Batman the Stone King, I just mentioned that one. Here's a novelization of Kingdom Come, which fills in a lot of things that aren't in the comic.
It's I would argue it's way better than the comic, and it's worth pointing out it's the same author as the Superman novel you started with.
Yeah, Elliot S. Magan. Man, I'd love to have that guy on the show.
So basically, his fans consider those three novels a trilogy of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think his Superman is quite the same. And I mean, obviously, there's the pre-crisis, I can move planets and I can whistle in D major to shatter a helicopter Superman. Whereas the one in Kingdom Come is he's basing it on Mark Waid's story. But that novel is really, I think one thing I loved is how it went into not just Superman, but the other heroes. And we sort of...
Right.
Because it's a 4-issue miniseries. And it's full of large paintings, so it's not like there's a ton of little panels that tell a story.
Right.
Half the book are splash pages, so there's a lot of story that he sort of added onto. I thought that was quite wonderful in that book.
Yeah, it might be blasphemy, but I do agree that this is better than the comics. Kingdom Come. Again, Justice League, this time with a focus on Superman, the Never-Ending Battle. Pretty good. Not up to the quality of Elliot S. Magan, but...
And I think the problem there is, while they were both comic book writers, Roger Stern is even more of your sort of like standard 80s to 90s.
Yeah.
He was the guy that if you needed someone to fill out a monthly comic book, he could pump out a 6.5, 7 out of 10 story consistently every month, on time, on 3 different books. And there's something to be said about writers like that. They can be wonderful in their role. But I think in a novel, it sort of shows he was out of his element, so to speak.
I saw on Elliot S. Magan's website a few months ago that he's just really adamantly against all these reboots that DC's been doing, and he's not there anymore, right? Hasn't been there for a while.
I want to say I don't think he's written for them since the 80s.
Yeah.
That novel came out obviously in the late 90s, but I mean, as far as a comic book, I'm not sure he's written anything in quite some time.
Yeah, but obviously it's very dear to his heart, and he's just like, stop with the reboots, you're ruining DC. Something to that effect. This is, oh man, this is good. It's called Devil's Cape by a guy named Rob Rogers. Devil's Cape, and it's a superhero novel unlike any I've ever read. I guess that's all I can really say. I definitely recommend it if you're looking for something like that. You guys have probably read this one. Soon I Will Be Invincible.
Yeah, that's fun.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Austin Grossman. Yeah.
And am I mistaken that started as a self-published book?
I don't know.
I might be mixing it up. I thought, because I know a lot of there was also one that was superheroes versus zombies that was, and I think that was the other one that they started to self-publish, and a publisher saw how well they were doing on Amazon and picked them up and sort of ran with it. I might be misremembering that, but
I enjoyed this a hell of a lot more than I thought I would. The Last Days of Krypton.
Yes,
by Kevin J. Anderson.
And to be clear, I am not Kevin J. Anderson's biggest fan. I think his Star Wars novels were always terrible. His Dune prequels were mediocre. His individual novels I couldn't get into, but that book, and he wrote another one, Batman, Superman, set in the 1950s. Enemies and Allies.
Enemies and Allies is actually next on my list.
Yeah, those books are actually great. I loved Enemies and Allies. The audio version I thought was also great. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it,
I have. Yeah,
it's I don't know. It's he really did such a good job with those stories, and I think he really understood what made those characters special. In Enemies and Allies, in particular, the way he wrote Luthor, excuse me,
the thing is, he writes it set in the 50s. And the only satellite up there is Sputnik, and it's scaring the Americans to death. And, and all this fear and paranoia and so on. And Superman appears. Bruce Wayne can't figure out how this guy's doing it. It's really, really interesting.
Batman is my favorite part of that book, I would argue. He's not because he's writing some sort of like, oh, no one's ever written Batman like this. People have written Batman like that for 80 years, but he does it so well. And the interaction with Superman as he gets to sort of know him or have to work with and against him. It's really, there's some great scenes in there.
Yeah. And that's probably one of the three best in this one. I picked up for a quarter somewhere, The Life and Death of Superman by Roger Stern. And I don't know how good it is.
So granted, I read that when I was in the 5th grade.
This is one.
5th grade. I'm sorry, Pete. I know you're crying now when I talk about how young I was when I read this. I read it when it came out because I was able to get it through like the Scholastic book order at school. And I remember enjoying it a lot, but I was also like 11 when I was reading it. So that may have influenced it. But I mean, the death of Superman was such a big deal at the time. As a young comic books fan, it's hard to explain to people now, but like no one was killing superheroes at the time.
And nothing happened in the news that day. This is pre-internet basically. And all of a sudden the headlines everywhere is Superman is dead. And DC is like, oh shit.
Well, what was great is even how they packaged the original comic book. It came with like the black armband and had like this bleeding Superman logo cover, and it's hard to explain. And the novel goes in that novel. There's also a young adults version that's not as good, but it really goes into sort of not just, oh, here's the battle where Superman dies, but it really goes into here's how the world would react if we had a Superman and then now he's dead.
Yeah.
And how the other heroes try to fill that gap and really struggle and can't do it. How the people that are close to Superman, like Lois Lane and his parents, who they know who he really was, but they can't tell anyone who he really was. How the death of Clark Kent, so to speak, affects everything. There's a lot in there. That's probably Roger Stern's best novel. Again, he's mostly working with material that someone else wrote, so maybe that made it a little bit easier for him. I don't know, but I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, well, that's really all I have. You guys have anything else?
There's one other novel I'd recommend, and it's
Yes.
from so back in the 70s, Marvel was doing their own novels. They had a line of novels, and they came out with an Incredible Hulk novel called Stalker from the Stars, and it's by Marv Wolfman. And I just read that one recently. It's a 70s novel written for, young adult, adolescents or whatever, but it's really kind of a fun, I don't know, there's something about the way the Incredible Hulk was written in the 70s that was just fun. And
and that TV series.
So I think this predates the TV series by a little bit, but it's that same kind of wandering Bruce Banner.
Yeah.
Gets into trouble as the Hulk.
Yeah.
I'd really recommend that one.
The way that he played Bruce Banner with this constant kind of sadness,
But this novel, it's kind of interesting. It's about like an alien that comes down and like can, I would hate to call it Lovecraftian. The monster is kind of Lovecraftian. The story, of course, it's a superhero story. But I think anyone would enjoy it. It's a fun. I mean, you probably read it in an hour and a half.
All right. Well, next week we have someone from the Mysterious Package Company, that's a pretty awesome concept. Check it out. Just Google it if you don't know what it is. And they do have a Cthulhu crate too. Several of them. King and Yellow crate. Did you say something, Pete?
No, they do. The Cthulhu crate is cool.
Yeah. Week after that, Cody Goodfellow. Week after that, which is June 2nd, Charles Dexter Ward podcast people, and some more podcast people after that, the folks from Pseudopod. So really looking forward to that. And then on June the 23rd, I proposed something interesting to Paul Tremblay and John Langan and Laird Barron. And I said, why don't you guys just come on the show and talk about whatever you want with each other? And they're like, yeah, I like the sound of that. So June 23rd.
I'll never complain about more John Langan.
No, he's great. All three of them are. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate it. And thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next week.